Alrighty, we can go ahead and get started as folks are still trickling in. Welcome back to the second module for the Science Policy and Advocacy Certificate Program. So excited to have you guys back here. Today, we'll be looking at effective advocacy strategies and communication for public policy with a special guest speaker today, whom I will introduce briefly as she'll take a deeper dive into her introduction later. But first, just wanted to get some administrative items out of the way, send some reminders, but also to make sure you're all set for today. So just heads up, Module 2 assignments, you'll be completing your first draft of your elevator pitch. This is now moving from that outline to sort of a video form or an audio form, and you'll be submitting that into the Dropbox there. That's due by the next section, the next session, and reviewers will be looking at these. So please ensure that they're submitted on time so that way we can get them to them to review and also provide context. So just really quickly, is the elevator pitch in video format? Yes. And if you need some additional help with that, some tips, some tricks, some resources, I will be sending out a resource document to help you get some of that information recorded, any type of editing, if there is any bare minimums, hopefully that will be pretty easy for you to pick up. For today's session then, beyond the administrative items, I will continue to answer questions in chat if you have any more, but today we are joined by Jennifer Paulus. She is the Chief Operating Officer at Ripple Effect. For today, we're really looking at how to effectively communicate your work to policymakers, so that way you can highlight the importance of that significant scientific research that you're conducting and or anything else that you're trying to convey. And there will be an active learning activity, which includes a little bit of role playing and really just group work for you to consolidate, think about ideas from a different perspective, do peer-to-peer support, network, and really to get the lesson learned today. So for our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Paulus, again, a brief background on her. Just some highlights. She earned her biochemistry PhD at the Duke University Medical Center and continued her postdoc there. She was, I believe, a AAAS fellow with the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health and is now the Chief Operating Officer at Ripple Effect. And she'll be sharing a little bit more about her journey before we jump into sort of exploring the effective communication for us to be able to talk better with our policymakers. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing here. And Jennifer, when you are good to go ahead and share your screen.
Wonderful. Yes, I can see.
Thank you. So as Joanne mentioned, my name is Jennifer Pohlhaus, and I'm delighted to be here with you today. And I really want to thank her and thank the organizers for inviting me. As she mentioned, my talk is about effective advocacy strategies and communication for public policy. And I chose this background with all the data on it, basically because one of the things that I think is really important about communication and about advocacy in particular related to communication is making sure that your voice and your message stands out as the signal from all of the noise. So that was my inspiration for choosing this. And I want to talk with you today and to share some stories, and specifically to start by sharing some stories about myself and then sharing some stories about advocacy examples. And the reason why I'm going to use the storytelling concept is because I think that using stories is a great way to make your message stand out, again, from this concept of standing out in terms of showing signal from noise. So that's a little bit of background just to kind of get you started in terms of my thinking. So in terms of the story about me, as I said, I would like to share with you kind of how I got on this path, and I'm not going to go through all the things that are on the slide because that would kind of not be a story. So my story starts out when I was beginning to enter actually my undergrad degree. And at the time, I knew that I really liked math and science, but I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. And I also knew that I really liked business and management and kind of like organizing things, bringing them together. And I really kind of leaned into the organizing part of what I really like to do. And I was actually on track for going to get a business degree. And I remember in high school, at the end of high school, someone saying like, "Oh, but you know, you're so good at math and science. Like, don't waste that. Like, you should go into math and science." And it's just one of those funny things. It's like it's a small statement, but it stuck with me for a really long time. And I kept thinking and thinking and thinking about it. And I just decided, well, I really do like math and science too. So maybe there's a way that I can go into a career where I can use my math and science as well as kind of like this business and organizing things. So I ended up going to my undergrad at a school that's known for being an engineer. It's called Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and it's in Troy, New York, which is in upstate New York, and went there to do science and math. And I actually received a scholarship, which is available to New York State students to go and to do science and math studying. While I was there, one of the things I learned was that they had a program where you could get your MBA in one additional year after your bachelor's. So you could stay on for 5 years in total and graduate with your MBA. So I was like, oh, this is great. This is a way that I can combine my love for science and math with my interest in business. And so I was on that track. And while I was on that track, when I got to the end of my my time, actually it was in my summer, my last summer there, I also participated in a co-op, which is kind of like where you can go and work, you know, for real at a company while you're still a student. And while I was there, I did this co-op at a company that later became Syngenta, which some of you may be familiar with. They do a lot of agribusiness. And while I was there, I was looking around and seeing all the other folks who were there with me, you know, who actually had these jobs at this, you know, place where people do science and math, quote, for their jobs. And I was realizing that nobody who was there had their MBA. No one who was there had their MBA. And what they had instead in terms of degrees was they had a PhD. And I thought, okay, well, I've been going for years on this plan that, you know, I'm going to be like getting my MBA and focusing on management in this way. And so I just thought, oh my gosh, now I have to change my plan, because really I had this picture that I didn't really understand reality. So then I kind of did an about face, and I was like, okay, well, I guess I have to go to graduate school and get my PhD. So I at the end of my undergrad was really when I was deciding to actually go to graduate school. And as you know from my bio, I did end up going to grad school and getting my PhD in biochemistry. But during the time while I was getting my PhD, I was thinking, well, you know, again, I still want to bring these things together. So, you know, what kind of career is there for me in actually when I go to take a job? And I went to different career fairs, and at some point in the career fair circuit that I went to, I went to one where it was folks talking about science policy, and the whole panel was about science policy. And as soon as I heard about science policy, I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. This is what I loved all those years about business and kind of bringing my two loves together. And so from there, I went about I just decided this is the track I want to be on. I have to learn about policy. I have to take courses at, you know, school to learn more about policy. I have to, you know, do internships if possible, whatever I can do to apply for this science policy program. And so that is what I did. I spent the latter half of my PhD program along the side from my biochemistry classes. I was also taking health policy courses at Duke, and I graduated from Duke with my PhD, and then also with a certificate in health policy. So at that point, I just decided, you know, I had decided what I wanted to go for, and that's what I went for. And from there, I've been involved in a lot of different things that are probably going to come out as I talk through my my advocacy examples. And I'm happy to also, if there's time later at the end, to share any stories about any of the other bullets that are on this slide. But with that, I think that's a great introduction about me and about, why I'm here. And I will, unless there are any questions at the moment, I will move on to the next slide. Okay, thank you for the thumbs up, Joanne. It's great. Great to be talking with you and to be sharing and to moving on to my advocacy examples. So once I got involved in the Science Policy Fellowship through the AAAS program, and some of you may have heard of it before, it's the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program. I was assigned to an office within the NIH that was called the Office of Research on Women's Health. And what was really exciting for me was that the project that I was working on actually came about because of advocacy. It would not have appeared otherwise. And the title of the project I was working on is called Beyond Bias and Barriers. And this was actually a study that the National Academies had done talking about why women don't advance in academia as with the same rate that that men typically advance in academia. And as a result of this National Academies report, which had come out, the chair of the person who wrote the report, she actually called up the director of NIH and said to him, here's this report. I don't want it to sit on the shelves. I want NIH to do something about it, and I want you to do something about it. And as a result of that phone call, the NIH director decided to create a working group and have a committee focused on this issue, and to have testable experiments that they could try out at NIH, and also things that NIH could fund in the extramural community, and work on changing policies for women based on the results of this report. So I think that's that's an important example. For me, it's very important because I wouldn't have had a chance to do, my fellowship if I hadn't been able to experience being on the other end of this advocacy effort. So that's my first example of advocacy to share with you. The second example of advocacy that I would like to share is about the National Postdoc Association. So I was on the board of the National Postdoc Association in the past, and I held a couple different positions on the Strategic Planning Committee, and also I was a vice chair of the NPA. And during the time that I was on the board, there were some folks who were on one of the committees of the NPA, and they were really focused on, at the time, what they were focused on was increasing the pay of postdocs, which certainly is a topic that has been advocated for many years, and is still being advocated for, and there has been some progress made over time, actually. But at the time, this was around the 2009 2010 sort of time frame, and many of the folks who were on the committee, the policy committee at the NPA, they were very excited about their issue, which is, understandable. And there was also excitement from the board about the position, the policy position, but they were very dismayed about the pace that NIH was moving in terms of making any changes to postdoc pay. And so we had a lot of it, the board had a lot of discussions and a lot of communications with this group of folks who were on the policy committee, because they kept saying, why aren't you demanding more? Why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you marching into NIH? Why aren't you, picketing? Why aren't you doing all, just very vocal, very, things which they thought would drive action. And in some way they may have driven action, but what was happening was the board was working on slower, maybe slower actions in order to make the changes. And the board was also working on developing relationships, especially long-term relationships with folks at the NIH, because you can imagine if you're part of a national organization like the MPA, you don't just want to come in charging in on one issue and, you know, make enemies and have no one listen to you. And again, let me also be clear, it's not that the folks at NIH, because I've worked with many of them as well, didn't want to increase the pay. I mean, a lot of folks were sympathetic to this cause and wanted to do something about it, but you have to remember the constraints in which they are in terms of policy. So basically what we had to do in terms of the board was to say, yeah, we're working on it, but, you know, we're working on it in a way that may not necessarily align with the way that, you know, that you're advocating for. And it was a really difficult time. In the end, you know, not everyone was happy with the MPA board, but, you know, again, it's another example of the folks have to make decisions. Maybe they make the right decisions, maybe they make the wrong decisions, but, you know, everyone is part of an organization and you have to realize the constraints that are there in terms of the organization that you're working with and how you want to move change forward. So the MPA is still a very relevant organization and has been sharing these policy positions over time. And so I see that there are a couple comments in the chat about this topic. So the first one says that they thought about this topic as well in terms of the pre-work and advocacy about postdoc grad student working conditions and pay and worker-led union organizing efforts. Yeah, and there are several groups that have made it their policy position to actually advocate for unions. And I know that different states also have different policies. So, and I think if not all of you, most of you are from California, which is the place where there are some unions for postdocs, but at many other states, it's not the case. And I think that was something as well that that the MPA had to keep in mind, because it was meant to be national and not state in particular. All right. So yeah, I think the other comments are examples to something else going on in Canada, which I would love to read about later, and talking about unions in the context. Yeah, so I think I've addressed those comments. Okay, and then my last example for advocacy examples is also related to the MPA, and it actually is about the establishment of the National Postdoc Appreciation Week, sort of, I guess, celebration week. And for those of you who do not know, that this is actually a week that Congress has passed in terms of appreciating postdocs. And this came about, again, during that same time that I was on the board. And the point that I wanted to make here is that it kind of came, in one meeting, we were talking about, different things we could do to increase the visibility of postdocs. And we were like, well, wouldn't it be great if there was a postdoc appreciation day or appreciation week? That would be so cool. And it was kind of said in passing. And then we kept talking. We're just like, well, why not? Why couldn't we do that? And, but we didn't want to go straight, to Congress, like, oh, create this day out of nothing. We wanted to, make sure that we could make a case and that we could, have evidence for why it would be important to do. And what we did as part of gathering our evidence was the first year we kind of just said, okay, NPA is going to say that it's a National Postdoc Appreciation Week, and NPA is going to organize with all of the local chapters, postdoc associations, at all the different schools, everyone that we have who's a member, and encourage them to have celebration activities at their institutions and their universities. And because we were able to do that and have that be a success, and we were able to promote that, what we were then able to do the subsequent year was to say to Congress, oh, we did this National Postdoc Appreciation Week in the past. It was really successful. Here are all the great things that went on. And doesn't Congress want to be seen as, somebody who also appreciates postdocs? And we made the case, and they agreed. And I guess they say the rest is history. But I don't think we would have been successful if we had started with Congress that first year without trying to do it on our own, and without trying to say, oh yeah, there is excitement, and here's all the things, and here's the reason why postdocs are part of the economic part, engine of the economy, and why making the case for why it might need to be a national event. So are there any other questions? Feel free to write in the chat, or raise your hand, or just come off mute if you have any questions about those examples. I heard you come off mute, but I didn't hear if there was a question there. Well, if you have a question, if you could go ahead and type it in the chat, because it's not coming across in your audio. That'd be great. All right, so while we're waiting for that question, let's see. Oh, there's another question which says, I'm from a small grad school, and it's very difficult to get grad students out of their lab zone. And it's very difficult to get our voices heard, mostly because we're so few in number. What would you suggest are some things we can do? Yeah, I think that's a challenge. I mean, not just in schools, it's really a challenge everywhere in every organization, right? You have a lot of people who are part of organizations, but who are maybe not so vocal. And this is the case too in work, and, just people have different levels of engagement for whatever group they're in. So I think the biggest suggestion I have is to make the most of the people who are engaged, and make the participation as fun and as fulfilling as you can for the things that, that are aligned to your mission. And that's a great segue in terms of, what I want to talk about next in terms of communication, because a way to make it engaging for folks is to make sure that you are clear with your message, which is what's so important about communication, and being sure that your message is going to be received. So with that, I will advance to the next slide, which is going to talk, I want to just very briefly talk about advocacy versus lobbying, and then I'm going to talk about advocacy and communications on the following slide. So a lot of the things that people think of when they hear the word advocacy is something that is probably more like lobbying. So I just want to go over this distinction briefly. Technically, advocacy is a broader circle, and lobbying is something that's within that broader circle of advocacy. And advocacy can be anything that is meant to bring about a change. So it can be public education campaigns, grassroots, organizing, coalition building, etc. Whereas lobbying is more specifically about trying to influence legislative policies or regulatory agencies. So of course I drew the Republican and Democrat graphics there. So lobbying is a type of advocacy, but it's not the only type of advocacy, and you can really advocate in many different ways and have many different communications to get across your message. So in terms of advocacy versus communications, what I wanted to say here is to point out that in terms of communications, it's really important to be clear about your message, because that's what people are going to remember. And you also don't want to waste people's time, right? So for advocacy, you need to keep these principles in mind that are good communications principles. And I found many of those were contained in some of the reading and the videos that were pre-work. So I hope that you all had a chance to take a look at some of that pre-work material. And another great tool to use as you're communicating is to use the storytelling technique, which I'm also trying to use to model that for you here today. So the next thing to think about in terms of communication is to think about the audience to whom you're communicating. And one of the group work sessions that we're going to do today is to have you communicate from the perspective of you having scientists as your audience. And so I'd like you to just take a minute and picture what you think a scientist might look like. And I know this is probably kind of a trick question because I think probably many of you are scientists, right? So you're thinking, well, I'm a scientist, or my friend's a scientist, or someone else on this Zoom, gallery is a scientist. And I put these logos up here from Microsoft. Those are just the icons that if you go to insert an icon, those are the two that pop up. So that's kind of what Microsoft thinks a scientist looks like. But I'd love for folks to kind of put in the chat what they think of when they think of a scientist. Is there anything that you could describe what a scientist might look like? So go ahead and just type anything in the chat. People on this call, okay, good. Let's hear more. What else? My friends, good. Attention to detail. Anyone can be a scientist if you practice and learn. Curious, thinker, creative. And in a lab coat, yes. I was looking for some of those stereotypical ones. I know they're stereotypical, but they're there. Passionate, glasses, microscope, experiments, apply the scientific method, field clothes, long pants, closed-toe shoes. This is great. PhD, credentials. I love it. Human. So yes, all these are good. So what I'm going to put on this slide is actually a picture of 3 different pictures that some young students did of a scientist when they were asked to draw a scientist. And there's actually, some of you may be aware, there's a movement out there called Draw a Scientist, and they're actually trying to move people's mind from a stereotypical picture of who you might think of as a scientist to kind of realize that there are a lot of different ways that you might think of a scientist. So it was great to hear all of your comments here to help prove my point. So here's a question for you to think about as I go through the next slide. How do you think you should communicate your message if you know that a scientist is going to be receiving it? So some of you kind of already answered that. Somebody who's going to be very attentive to detail, right? So they're probably going to want detail. Someone who's going to use fancy science terms that only their peer scientists understand, right? So that's how you might think of presenting your material if your audience is going to be a scientist. Now, I want you to think about what you think of in your head when you think of policymaker. And how is that different from what you think of when you think of a scientist? Go ahead and pop things. Okay, we've got old white man, suits and ties, politicians, someone in a suit, handshakes, making laws, getting paid off. So I guess money, talkative, briefcase. Yeah, these are great. So I don't have a picture of a policymaker. I searched on Google. There was no great picture, but you guys all have pictures in your head as well. So again, just kind of thinking through how you might change the message if you have a different audience in mind. And it's good to, as you think about communicating, to have these ideas in your head so that you can realize what biases you have and what biases you're bringing to the conversation, right? And know that we're all human. And even if we try to not have biases, we all have some level of biases. It's actually what makes us, able to process things is we bucket information, and you kind of bucket information into groups, right? And what are groups? Groups of people, well, that leads to stereotypes. So it's kind of innate in our human brains, the way that we categorize. And it's good to just, again, take that step back and kind of realize what you're assuming about someone when you're starting to tell them something. So with that, I think, just these 3 tips. And again, these also came from the pre-read. These were not my tips, but I liked them, so I wanted to highlight them here. It's important to understand your audience and tailor your response or your message to your audience. It's important to identify the windows of opportunity that you have to share any influence that, or any ideas that you're trying to use for influence. And then thirdly, to engage with real world policymaking rather than waiting for a rational, orderly process to appear. And I think this one is important too, because like the first example that I shared with you, where this chair of the National Academy's report was like, if she didn't take that out, if she waited and waited for NIH to do something, maybe they would have done something, maybe they would have gotten around to it, but she took the action and she called up, somebody who was kind of her peer on the national national sort of arena in terms of these topics, and was able to make the change that that other folks were not able to do, because she just kind of engaged in the real world at the time and didn't wait until it was a perfect time. All right, so with that, I'd like you to start thinking about your group work, and shortly Joanne is going to put you all into groups, and within your group, what I would like is that one person within the group, at least one person within the group, talk through a policy pitch. And if you have time, you can have more than one person talk through their policy pitch. But we're going to kind of do it in 3 ways. We're going to have you do your policy pitch for a scientist. We're going to have you do your policy pitch for a policymaker, and we're going to have you do your policy pitch for an 8th grader. Oh, I didn't have you picture, but I'm sure now that I've said it, you can all have 8th graders in your head. Maybe you have any 8th graders who are part of your families, or if not, maybe, I know in the past you all made it through 8th grade, so you can dig back in your memories for your 8th grade. So these are some basic elements that you might want to include in a policy pitch. This is specific to policymakers, but you can still think about those in both of the other audiences as well. So Joanne, anything you want to say about the group work or to get folks ready?
Yeah, could I actually grab the screen share?
Yeah.
Perfect. Alrighty, so I am going to be sending you guys into breakout rooms. You'll be in between 3 to 4 folks, and go ahead and introduce yourself. Decide on a topic that you want to focus on, and you'll be finding your group slide page based off of the room number that you're in. If you're in room 1, you're on group page number 1. These will be like a Google Slides that you can populate the information together. And then we're going to reconvene and share and chat. And a couple of folks will pick on to share out loud. So be sure to pick someone in your group that is feeling brave tonight. And if you're like, this is not us today, just send it in the chat and we'll find someone else to speak on your behalf. So I'm going to go ahead and drop in.
So Joanne, before you do that, how long are we going to have them do all 3 groups, all 3 audiences right now, or just the first one?
Let's stick with the first one, and then I think we can at least get to the second one. And let's say if we don't make it to the third one, then at least everything is sort of broken out. So this one is just primarily as a scientist to a scientist. Let's focus on just that. So everyone can get that populated in there. And if you have any trouble getting onto there, just make sure you click in, ask your friends. I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms now, and we'll see you in about 15 minutes.
So as you're coming back, I think we're going to be looking for at least one report out. Joanne, do you want to say anything, or should we call on someone, look for volunteers? What do folks usually do?
We can start looking for volunteers, but if you want, go ahead and just copy and paste what you guys have combined together really into the chat. And I think I saw really good ones from group 28. If anyone wants to speak there, as well as pretty significant amount of text on group 29 as well. So I'm going to volunteer you guys, but you guys are welcome to bow as well.
So maybe someone from group 28 or 29 can kind of tell us what they were thinking about when they were working on their policy pitch to another scientist.
Okay, I am a part of group 29, me and Aaron, I can jump in. So we, in the idea of just like sharing this policy pitch idea with scientists, we were thinking of trying to be as technical as possible. And I don't really know. I mean, there's probably ways we could have been more technical, but the policy pitch is coming from my idea, adapting local composting centers to handle food waste. And so I would start by sharing that I'm a postdoctoral researcher at NASA studying large-scale atmospheric circulation and its response to increasing greenhouse gas emissions, which involves CO2, methane, et cetera, and how these projected changes include shifting of storm traps, changing global patterns of precipitation, increasing frequency of climate extremes. So that's kind of presenting the problem and how my research connects to the stated problem. But the solution and what the policy is trying to tackle is empowering individuals and local communities to reduce methane emissions by composting food waste instead of letting food waste go into landfill, and how doing so would be a significant contribution to mitigating climate change. So yeah.
Thanks, Molly, for sharing. I appreciate you speaking up in front of the group and just charging right in. That's great to have that. And while you were speaking, one of your group members kind of put in the chat something about waste disposal and it being an environmental concern as well. So it sounds like you had. Were you in the group? That was the group you were in, right?
Oh, no, I was actually in group 29, but it's funny
okay.
how, group 28 kind of has a similar idea.
Yeah, so I think both of those examples are really helpful, and I think tying it back to something that folks might have experience with is a great way to make your pitch. And that's one of the things that was catching to me about group 28, where they started and they said, imagine a scenario where groundbreaking scientific research is being conducted. It catches those first words, imagine. It's like, oh, it's so different from like, hello, my name is Jennifer. I'm going to talk with you today. Like, it's like, it just drops you right into the middle of that story. Imagine something that's occurring. So, and, whoever was writing this in group 28, I imagine that this was probably not the first time you were doing such an exercise like this. So don't feel discouraged if your example didn't start with something so eye-catching as that, or ear-catching, I guess. It takes many iterations. So you first want to get down, what is your message? What do you want to get across? And sometimes just iterating through to kind of get that hook that is of interest to the listener.
Alrighty, excellent. So we can move on to perhaps our second topic then. Now, switching gears, you'll be going back to the same groups. And now you'll be looking at policymakers as opposed to scientists. And depending on time, we might be able to get to our last group of 8th graders, but we can also talk more about sort of other advocacy examples. So in the chat, we're moving to another document. So you can keep the other one open if you would like, but this is just in case we didn't have time. Go ahead and click on that. I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms, ask a friend if you need it. I'll also paste this link into the other one if you need more time to hop on. So moving on to policymakers. Welcome back, everyone, as you're coming in. Again, we'll be doing sort of a copy and paste if you wanted to drop it into chat, as well as looking at a couple groups and their responses.
Yeah, I was actually hoping that we could start off by copy and paste. So if someone has something good to share from their group, please go ahead and pop it into the chat. Oh, got people starting with those imagination words. What if one day you woke up to discover all the beautiful trees, flowers, and wildlife around you had vanished? Only concrete and asphalt remains. So this is very very visual, right? So gets you thinking, what if? And then this is the future that awaits us if we do not take action. So it has a call to action there. So nice job. How was it in terms of putting this together? Someone from the group want to share? Was it easy to come up with this, or did you go through a lot of iterations?
Excuse me. Hello.
Please
Hello.
share.
I was part of the group. Something we did was kind of built on as we went. Like we started out with the storytelling and the dramatic story, and then we added in, okay, we need to decide what action they're going to take. And then we said, okay, let's get specific. And we found like one person to target. And then we also said, like, chose a group to have as our constituents to back us up. So we added on more details as we went.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the iterative nature of it is really great. And thanks for speaking to that, especially after we had discussed that in the previous version. I think it is something that can really come out, and you don't necessarily need a lot of time. You might just need people to kind of bounce ideas off of each other and to keep working on honing those ideas. So nice job on that. Any other folks have any comments to share? Specifically, I would be curious from anyone, not just the groups who popped in the chat, but what was different for you about the second group than this? So trying to speak to a policymaker versus trying to speak to a scientist in the first one. What were some differences that you noticed, if any? And you can go ahead, anyone can answer in the chat. Or yeah, Brianna, please.
For our group, something that was different where we had to identify what the action items we wanted the policymaker to make versus with the scientists, we were a bit more focused with having research and evidence to sort of back up the importance of our problem. But for this time around, we really wanted to focus on, well, what do we want them to do after we convince them that this is a problem?
Great, thank you. And Emma, what about you?
Yeah, I think like it was a difference in rhetoric as well. Like when we're speaking to the scientist, it was more so like with the logos, like, logic and, laying out the facts. And speaking to the policymaker was like, okay, we want to use more of an ethos tone and like speak to like this emotional story and relate to them as like a human being.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for sharing that. I see folks are chatting similar things into the chat. Let's hear from Hamed as well. You have your hand up.
Okay, thank you. So we kind of started by introducing the problem in a way that they kind of understand what everyone feels, talking about the impact of the fossil fuel and how hot it is in summer in the US, and which is something that even all the lawmakers are presently feeling, and how much money, dollars, is being spent, committed into giving those companies, the industry, the fossil fuel industry, to give them the subsidy to do their, to run their company, the industry, and the devastating impact of that and the environment. So we come from that point of view, and we also come from a point of view of kind of reducing this subsidy will also kind of help in transition into clean energy, which we think is something that the lawmaker would appreciate and would want to, work on.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, and I'm seeing similar thoughts here in the chat as well. Emphasis on finances, emphasis on things that that the lawmaker is looking for, and kind of that call to action. So I think thanks for sharing, the three of you who shared, and thanks for putting in the chat your thoughts. And just the final question I have is, we're not going to have time to do the breakout for the eighth grade audience, but same question, what do you think might be different if you were going to speak to an eighth grader? So without doing the exercise, just think about what might be different, and go ahead and put that in the chat. What would be different, if anything? So the last one was punchy and attention grabbing. I think that was for eighth graders and not policymaker.
I think it would be more, I think, simpler and more intuitive, so that they can understand with real life examples. So we could start with an analogy, just to catch their interest, and then still explain the topic a bit further, as opposed to going straight to the topic with the scientists or the policymakers.
Right. Yes. Great. Thank you, Joella, for sharing.
I think another thing that would be important with eighth graders is to keep a fairly positive approach to them, because you don't want to demoralize them into thinking that there's no hope. So even if you're talking about a problem, it needs to end or start, like it needs to be wrapped into a positive setting that, okay, there is a problem, but we can do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sukriti. I appreciate your thoughts. And similar thoughts are coming in on the chat. Use lots of visuals, simple, different calls to action. That's true. Maybe a broader topic, and then narrowing down maybe a video. So these are all great ideas. I guess the last question I want to leave you with is more of a thought exercise than something that I necessarily want you to respond with. But wouldn't the suggestions that you're making in the chat and the suggestions that you're making out loud be appealing to someone who's not an eighth grader? Wouldn't a scientist also want to have it be fun, or have a video, or have simple, engaging graphics? And you all are scientists, right? Like, you want to have fun too. You want to have, and here's the other thing, even if you're a scientist, you're not necessarily the type of scientist that would have the background on the policy topic, right? So I just want you to kind of think through that. Because it's the same thing if you're a policymaker. Like, yeah, I think there are, I'm being a little bit facetious, right? Because you probably don't want to do exactly the same thing, right? The call to action for a policymaker is different than a call to action for an eighth grader. But the types of things that you would polish for an eighth grader, because you want to make sure they understand, let's use those same skills and polish that as well for the policymaker, and polish that as well for the scientists, because we all live in a world of information overload. And as I said from the beginning, we want to cut through that noise. We want to make a signal from the noise. So those same criteria that you're thinking about when you're putting something together for an eighth grader to make sure it's sharp and clear and can be put on immediately, those are the same things that you want to have in any of your messages. So with that, that's everything that I wanted to cover. It looks like we have about 8 minutes left. So I wanted to take a minute and see if Adriana, who's on the call, and I believe you all know who she is and have been introduced to her with her before. She has experience in advocacy as well, and if there was any stories she wanted to share with the group.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So I, interestingly enough, I also got into this space advocating for postdoc salaries. So it's an interesting, somewhat transition, because I was a postdoc. It was sort of bottoms up, trying to sort of go against the power dynamics and influence universities to give higher pay for postdocs, which is one way to look at the sort of what you can do as a trainee and within your institution. We're trying to influence scientists and folks who help train them, right? Folks in universities. In that sense, I think it was more thinking through this exercise a little bit. it was a more, I think we used kind of individual approach because we were all postdocs and we sort of commiserated with the other folks who were in the room and try to fight sort of for the collective, right? Which is not to say that you shouldn't do that as a policymaker, but a few years later, and also relate to what Jennifer said, is the only reason that I ended up working on postdoc issues at the federal level is because I had advocated for it as a postdoc and had used that data and was already passionate about that. And so I encourage you to continue fighting for the things you want to see change. But in my role with the University of California, we ended up writing some language on postdocs for the CHIPS and Science Act, which you probably heard about. We essentially, and this is another story of sort of how those things happen, but it's kind of the flip side of that because it was top down. We were, speaking to the House Science Committee. We had connections there and were able to sort of pitch this section to them to essentially include postdocs in the bill and one other section that, not to get too technical, but the idea being that in that case, it was very sort of broadly focused of how, of course, they're interested in maintaining the US as a leader, in the world in science, right? That sort of framing, right? And why. And it was interesting too, because nobody really on the committee, I think, had gone to grad school and postdoc. And so, still using that and saying, well, as a postdoc, I know what it's like, but now I'm using a different framing, right? Which is talking to the committee about why supporting postdocs is going to help the country, very broadly and very simple explanation. So that also worked. So that's a good example, I think, of what you can do as a trainee, kind of grassroots, bottoms up, and also top down to staffers who care about these things and will listen to you, but all is related. So hopefully that's helpful. It gives you a little bit of perspective on this issue and how you can come at an issue from multiple angles.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
And just quickly, there's a last question in here about if there's a website that can tell you what level of the audience you're reaching. I don't know. I'm going to crowdsource that in case folks know. I know one thing is if you use Microsoft Word, it will tell you the reading level of what you're writing. So that can help you make your words a little bit simpler. ChatGPT may be able to help. Yes, ChatGPT may also be able to help with that. But I did want to make that plug in Word. It does come across right in Word. You can use the function for proofreading at the level. Yes.
If you just scrolled up to Brianna's question.
Yeah, so she says the importance of including an attention-grabbing story in a policy pitch, but I've also seen advice to state your main message right away at the beginning. How do you balance the two? Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't know that I have. It's probably a matter of A, personal style, and B, know your audience. Again, know your audience, right? So most people, they'll give you 2 minutes. So I would go with whatever you think that you want, but you want to get them right from the beginning. So I don't know if I would necessarily you could do the main message in the beginning as long as it's attention grabbing. I would do attention grabbing either way, I guess, is sort of my bottom line. I would do attention grabbing either way, but exactly how you want to phrase it and what order you want to mention it in, I think that's going to depend on your audience and what you want them to do with it.
Yeah, I can give one example because I've sort of used maybe 2 tactics, right? So I think, and again, knowing which policymakers are more interested in data, for example. So when I was at SFN, we were advocating for neuroscience research funding, why we need more funding for research, which is somewhat of a no-brainer, but interesting that some legislators would react to data, like how many people in the country have Alzheimer's. This is why we need to support this funding, that sort of thing. And then one legislator that we knew, and I don't know if we knew this beforehand, but it may be known, and also maybe knowing something about them personally helps, But the reason that he supported SFN is because his mom had Alzheimer's, and he said, well, I support this research because I have a personal connection. So that's a good example of, knowing who you're talking to, because he didn't care about the data. He said, I have a personal story. This is why I care. Of course, he'll say, yes, okay, I understand this is a big issue, but some people might react to data. Some people might react to personal or have a personal reason to support something too. So knowing the background is good.
All right, thanks, Adriana, for jumping in on that. That's great. Joanne, anything else?
I think there's one more question and we'll cut it there. So any advice on avoiding under communication or over communication? How do you know how much is enough?
I would always err on less, and people can ask for, I guess it depends if it's verbal or written. In verbal, the people will always ask for more. So be prepared to tell more, but I would kind of pause and just share and have them ask, because then you can also tell if they're engaged. If it's written, then I would take an approach where you're starting with the most important information and including more detailed information at the end, but maybe in sort of like an appendix or like a background section or something like that. Even if it's a policy piece, like for the fellowship, fellowship that I applied for and that I told you about earlier, you have to write a memo for that, and it has to be 1 page. And at the bottom of the page, there's like background. I mean, mine had background information. A lot of other ones that I've reviewed have had background information at the bottom. So it's like, you can imagine what those questions are of your audience when they hear it. Like, what is their subsequent question that they might have? You want to anticipate that and put it in the background, but put that at the end, not at the beginning.
Alrighty, excellent. Thank you all for joining us. Please connect with Jennifer on LinkedIn, and I'll be sending out an email follow-up for more details, reminders, and we'll see you on next week's session with Melissa Vargas and the Union of Concerned Scientists for Power Map. Thank you all. I'll stay behind to take any questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye.